Most men don't lose their families in a single moment. They lose them while chasing applause, the professor said. And Daniel Whitmore felt the words land harder than any business failure he had ever endured. He hadn't come to Harvard to be humbled. At 62, Daniel had built a logistics company from a two-car garage in Ohio into a corporation with offices in 5 states and annual revenue that once crossed $100 million. And he was used to sitting in the front row, not because he needed to learn, but because he liked to be seen learning. The lecture hall at Harvard Business School was polished oak and quiet authority, sunlight stretching across rows of suited executives and visiting alumni. And Daniel had taken his seat with the calm confidence of a man who believed he had already figured life out. The event was titled Ancient Chinese Philosophy and Modern Leadership, and he expected metaphors about strategy, maybe something clever about Sun Tzu and market competition, something he could repeat at the next board meeting. Instead, the visiting scholar, a soft-spoken man with silver hair and a voice steady as winter air, began with Lao Tzu. "The man who conquers others is strong," he read, pausing just long enough for the room to settle. "But the man who conquers himself is mighty." A few people nodded thoughtfully. Daniel folded his arms. He had conquered markets. He had negotiated contracts across conference tables in Chicago and San Francisco. He had stared down competitors and won. Mighty was a word investors once used to describe him. Yet as the professor continued, speaking of water wearing down stone not by force, but by persistence, Daniel found his mind drifting not to quarterly earnings, but to a kitchen table 20 years earlier, his wife seated across from him, asking if he could skip just one late meeting to attend their son's high school debate tournament. He had promised to try. He had not shown up. The professor spoke about balance, about the danger of mistaking control for wisdom, and Daniel felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest. For 35 years he had measured success in square footage, in stock options, in the horsepower of the German sedan he leased every 3 years. After his divorce last fall, finalized in a courthouse less than 10 miles from the home he no longer lived in, he told friends it was mutual, that sometimes people simply grow apart. What he did not say was that his ex-wife had grown tired of eating dinner alone in a 4,000-square-foot house. What he did not admit was that his son, now 32 and living in Denver, had stopped calling first. Around him, other men in tailored jackets scribbled notes. Daniel stared at the polished wood desk in front of him. The professor quoted Confucius next. "To put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must first cultivate our personal life." The words moved through the hall like a quiet current. Daniel had put companies in order. He had reorganized departments, replaced underperforming managers, restructured debt. But he had never considered that the disorder in his own home might have been connected to the order he demanded everywhere else. He remembered the night his son left for college, loading boxes into the back of an SUV, offering a quick hug before turning away. Daniel had given him a firm handshake instead, a gesture he once believed signaled respect. Now, sitting under the carved beams of a Harvard lecture hall, he wondered if it had signaled distance. The professor closed his notebook and looked out over the audience. "Many men," he said gently, "learn too late that achievement without connection is a hollow victory." Daniel did not nod. He did not look around to see who else might be uncomfortable. He simply sat there, a successful man in a room full of successful men, realizing that for the first time in decades, he was not certain he had won it all. Daniel did not speak to anyone as the lecture ended. He remained seated until the rows around him began to empty, listening to the low murmur of executives discussing strategy as if nothing personal had been said. Outside, the late afternoon air in Cambridge carried the crisp edge of early fall, and he walked slowly across the brick courtyard, past students who looked young enough to be his grandchildren, their backpacks slung casually over their shoulders. He had once moved with that kind of certainty, believing time was something that stretched endlessly ahead. Now he was acutely aware that at 62, time measured itself differently. In the back seat of the black sedan that had driven him from Logan Airport that morning, he stared out the window at passing brownstones and thought about the first office he ever rented, a narrow space above a hardware store with a window unit that barely cooled the room during humid Ohio summers. He had worked 18-hour days back then, telling his wife it was temporary, telling himself it was necessary. Temporary had turned into decades. Necessary had become habit. He remembered the year his company crossed $50 million in revenue, the celebration dinner at a steakhouse in downtown Cleveland, the applause from investors, the framed plaque that still hung in his home office. He also remembered that the same week his son had asked him to help build a Pinewood Derby car for a school competition. Daniel had written a check for new tools instead and told him to be creative. At the time, he called it encouragement. Sitting in the back of the car now, he wondered if it had been absence disguised as advice. His phone buzzed with an email from his chief operating officer about an acquisition opportunity in Texas, projected growth percentages neatly outlined in bullet points. Daniel read it twice, then locked the screen. For the first time in years, the numbers did not quicken his pulse. He checked his call log instead. The last conversation with his son had lasted 3 minutes and 12 seconds. It had been about flight delays and a busy schedule. No argument. No warmth either. He leaned back against the leather seat and closed his eyes, hearing again the professor's calm voice about cultivating one's personal life before attempting to order the world. Daniel had ordered the world in ways that impressed shareholders. He had not ordered his priorities. The driver asked politely if he preferred the hotel on the Charles River or a quieter route through side streets. Daniel hesitated before answering, as if even that small decision carried more weight than usual. He chose the longer route. He wanted time. He wanted the silence between destinations. For decades, he had filled every gap with meetings, projections, negotiations measured in miles flown and contracts signed. Now, in the quiet hum of a car moving at 30 miles per hour through a city that did not know his name, Daniel felt something unfamiliar rising. To the surface, it was not regret loud enough to overwhelm him. It was quieter than that. It was recognition. Recognition that achievement had been his language, but connection had always required a different one, and he had never taken the time to learn it. The hotel room overlooked the Charles River, its surface reflecting the fading orange light of early evening, and Daniel stood by the window without turning on the lamps, watching rowing shells cut clean lines through the water as if direction were something simple and agreed upon. He placed his leather briefcase on the desk, but did not open it, even though inside were printed financial projections and a folder labeled Texas Expansion in bold blue letters. For more than 30 years, he would have reviewed those numbers before dinner, highlighting margins, calculating risk, measuring opportunity in percentages and miles. Instead, he loosened his tie and sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the quiet press against him. Silence used to irritate him. Silence meant inefficiency. Tonight it felt like a mirror. He thought about the phrase the professor had repeated, about cultivating the personal life before attempting to direct anything larger, and he began to see his past not as a sequence of achievements, but as a pattern. He had always chosen what was measurable. Revenue could be tracked. Market share could be increased. Employee productivity could be optimized. But affection could not be scheduled into 30-minute increments, and presence could not be delegated. He remembered the year his son moved to Denver for a job in renewable energy. Daniel had offered strategic advice about stock options and career ladders, explaining how to negotiate relocation bonuses and performance incentives. His son had listened politely and then said he was more interested in meaningful work than in maximizing income. Daniel had laughed at the time, not cruelly, but dismissively, as if meaning were a luxury reserved for later decades. Now, sitting alone in a room that cost more per night than his first apartment's monthly rent, he wondered who had understood life more clearly. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old photographs, images he rarely paused to examine. There was a picture from a family vacation in Maine when his son was 10 years old, standing on a rocky shoreline with wind pushing his hair across his forehead. Daniel had taken the call of an investor that afternoon while his wife and son explored tide pools without him. He remembered telling himself that securing funding would guarantee many more vacations in the future. The future had arrived, but the vacations had grown fewer. He set the phone down and walked to the small writing desk near the window. For a moment, he considered drafting an email to his executive team, outlining adjustments to their acquisition strategy, something decisive and efficient. Instead, he opened the contacts list again and hovered over his son's name. His thumb rested there longer than it ever had before. He was not rehearsing an argument. He was not preparing a lecture about responsibility. He was trying to decide whether he had the courage to say something unfamiliar. The room remained quiet except for the faint hum of climate control and distant traffic below. Daniel realized that conquering markets had required confidence, but confronting himself required humility, and humility was a skill he had never practiced. For the first time in years, he understood that the next decision he made might matter more than any contract he had signed, not because it would change his net worth, but because it might begin to change the distance that had quietly grown between him and the people who once waited for him at the dinner table. Daniel kept his thumb over his son's name for nearly a full minute before he finally pressed call, and as the phone began to ring, he felt a tension that no boardroom negotiation had ever created. He was not afraid of rejection in business, but he was uncertain how to navigate silence in something personal. The line rang 4 times before it went to voicemail, and he listened to the automated voice instructing him to leave a message after the tone, realizing that he had not prepared what to say because he had always believed preparation was unnecessary with family. When the tone sounded, he did not speak immediately. For years he had filled every pause with advice, direction, or correction. Now he understood that what he needed to offer was different. He cleared his throat and said his son's name slowly, not as a command but as recognition. He said that he was in Boston for a lecture and that he had been thinking about some things. He stopped there, resisting the urge to turn the message into a lesson. He did not mention stock options or career trajectories. He did not offer solutions. He simply said that he hoped they could talk soon, that there were things he wished he had handled differently, and that he was beginning to see that success did not excuse absence. When he ended the call, the room felt quieter than before. He set the phone on the desk and walked back to the window, watching the last traces of daylight fade from the river. In the past, he would have judged that voicemail as weak. He would have believed that authority required certainty. Yet the professor's words about water returning to its source echoed in his mind, and he began to understand that strength might not always appear firm. He thought about the divorce papers he had signed months earlier, the polite exchange in the courthouse hallway, the way his former wife had thanked him for providing stability over the years. Stability had been his offering. Presence had not. He remembered the night she had once asked him if he could sit with her on the porch for 10 minutes, without checking email. He had agreed, but kept his phone face up on the table, glancing at notifications that glowed brighter than the sunset. He had believed that multitasking was efficiency. Now he recognized it as divided attention. The climate control unit hummed softly behind him, maintaining a perfect 72 degrees, and Daniel considered how much of his life had been engineered for comfort and predictability. He had insulated himself from risk in every measurable way, yet he had never risked admitting fault. That realization settled over him not as a dramatic revelation, but as a steady truth. He understood that calling his son once would not repair years of distance, just as reading a few ancient teachings would not transform decades of habit. Change, like water shaping stone, required repetition. He moved to the desk and opened his briefcase at last, but instead of reviewing acquisition documents, he pulled out a blank sheet of hotel stationery. He wrote a single sentence at the top in careful handwriting. Conquer yourself first. He stared at the words, recognizing that they were not a slogan for shareholders, but a directive for himself. And for the first time since the lecture began that afternoon, Daniel felt that the real work of his life was only now beginning. Daniel woke before sunrise. The hotel room still wrapped in a dim blue light that softened the edges of the furniture and made the city beyond the window look distant and almost weightless. He did not reach for his phone immediately, which in itself felt unusual, as if he were resisting a reflex developed over decades. Instead, he sat upright in the bed and listened to the quiet rhythm of his own breathing, noticing how rarely he had allowed himself to begin a day without urgency. In the past, mornings were for scanning international markets, replying to overnight emails, setting the tone for teams spread across time zones. Today there was no immediate demand except the one forming internally. He stood and walked to the window, watching early rowers glide across the Charles River in long, synchronized strokes, their movement steady rather than forceful. The image stayed with him. Progress did not require noise. He thought again about the sentence he had written on the hotel stationery the night before and felt the weight of it differently in the morning light. Conquering himself would not mean abandoning ambition or dismantling the company he had built. It would mean examining the assumptions that had guided him without question. He showered, dressed slowly, and sat at the small desk with a cup of black coffee he had brewed in the room. The folder labeled Texas Expansion remained unopened. Instead, he opened his email and began typing a message to his executive team. He did not announce a dramatic shift in corporate direction. He simply delegated the upcoming negotiations to his chief operating officer and explained that he would be stepping back from day-to-day oversight for the next few weeks. He described it as a strategic recalibration. For the first time, the phrase felt honest. After sending the message, he checked his phone. There was no missed call yet from his son, no return voicemail. He felt the old impulse to interpret that silence as dismissal, but he resisted it. Change required patience, and patience was a discipline he had rarely practiced outside of financial forecasting. He remembered advising young entrepreneurs that long-term growth demanded restraint, that not every opportunity should be seized immediately. He had applied that wisdom to capital, but not to conversation. As the sun rose higher, light filled the room completely, revealing ordinary details that had been hidden in shadow the night before. Daniel recognized that much of his life had operated the same way. In bright boardrooms and public achievements, he had been clear and decisive. In the quieter spaces of home, he had allowed shadows to remain unexamined. He finished his coffee and looked once more at the river below. The rowers had changed positions, rotating who set the pace, sharing the strain rather than placing it on one person alone. He realized that leadership inside a family could not mirror leadership inside a corporation. Authority at work depended on hierarchy. Connection at home depended on presence. Daniel picked up his phone again, not to check numbers or projections, but simply to hold it with intention. He understood that rebuilding trust would not happen through a single apology or a carefully worded message. It would happen through consistency measured not in dollars or miles flown, but in conversations sustained over time. For decades, he had equated value with productivity. That morning, standing in a quiet hotel room in Boston, he began to consider that value might also be measured by the willingness to remain, to listen, and to adjust course even after the map had been followed faithfully for years. Daniel's phone vibrated just after 9 in the morning as he was reviewing the river one more time before checking out of the hotel. And when he looked down and saw his son's name on the screen, he felt a steadying breath move through him rather than the sharp rush of adrenaline he might once have felt before a high-stakes negotiation. He answered on the second ring, not wanting to appear overly eager, but not delaying either. His son's voice sounded cautious at first, as if unsure what version of his father would respond. Daniel noticed that instinct immediately. For years, conversations between them had carried an invisible structure, with Daniel asking about productivity, promotions, long-term plans. Today he did not begin with a question about work. He said he was glad his son called back, and that he meant what he had said in the voicemail. There was a brief silence on the line, not tense, but unfamiliar. His son asked what had changed. Daniel looked out the window at the river and chose his words carefully. He explained that he had attended a lecture that forced him to consider the difference between achievement and alignment. He admitted that he had spent most of his life optimizing results while assuming relationships would maintain themselves automatically. He did not defend his choices. He did not justify long hours or missed milestones. He simply acknowledged that providing financially had felt sufficient at the time, and that he now understood it had not been the same as being present. On the other end of the call, his son exhaled slowly. He spoke about growing up admiring his father's discipline, but also feeling as though he had to compete with conference calls and deadlines for attention. Daniel listened without interruption, resisting the urge to explain context or correct perception. Listening required restraint, and restraint felt unfamiliar but necessary. He realized that throughout his career he had prided himself on decisive responses delivered within seconds. Now he allowed pauses to remain, giving space for sentences to unfold fully. His son mentioned choosing renewable energy not only for income potential, but because he wanted his work to contribute to something sustainable. Daniel felt the contrast between their definitions of success. He did not argue. Instead, he said he respected that decision and that perhaps he had been too quick in the past to measure value only in financial returns. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, longer than any they had shared in recent years. It did not resolve everything. It did not erase history. But it felt different in tone, less like a performance and more like an exchange. When the call ended, Daniel remained standing by the window, aware that something subtle had shifted. The river outside continued its steady flow, unaffected by individual conversations, yet shaped over time by consistent movement. He understood that rebuilding trust would follow a similar pattern. Not dramatic gestures, not declarations. Repeated alignment between words and actions. For decades, he had believed leadership required certainty projected outward. Now he began to see that leadership within his own life required honesty directed inward first, and then expressed quietly, consistently, without expectation of immediate reward. Daniel checked out of the hotel just before noon and asked the driver to take him back to Logan Airport. But he did not open his laptop during the ride as he normally would have. Instead, he replayed the conversation with his son in his mind, not searching for mistakes, but recognizing moments where he had chosen to listen rather than instruct. That distinction felt small on the surface, yet significant beneath it. At the airport terminal, surrounded by travelers pulling rolling suitcases and scanning departure boards, Daniel noticed how accustomed he had become to motion without reflection. For decades, airports had been extensions of his office, places where he finalized deals over wireless connections and measured productivity in miles traveled per year. He once calculated that he flew more than 100,000 miles annually at the peak of his career. He wore that number like a badge of dedication. Standing in line for security, he wondered how many of those miles had brought him closer to the people who mattered most. On the flight back to Cleveland, he chose a window seat and declined the offer to upgrade to a larger cabin, something he would never have done in the past. It was not about cost. It was about intention. He wanted the ordinary experience, the narrow seat, the shared armrest, the reminder that status was not the same as substance. As the plane climbed above the clouds, he looked down at the patchwork of cities and highways shrinking beneath him and thought about scale. From 30,000 feet, the office buildings that once defined his identity were indistinguishable from residential neighborhoods. Perspective altered importance. He took out the sheet of hotel stationery he had folded into his jacket pocket and read the sentence again. Conquer yourself first. The words felt less like a command and more like an invitation. He began listing small actions he could take once he returned home, not dramatic gestures, but consistent adjustments. Weekly calls with his son that were not centered on career advice. An honest conversation with his former wife to acknowledge what he had begun to understand, not to reopen old wounds, but to offer clarity. Fewer evening meetings scheduled automatically out of habit. He realized that transformation did not require abandoning responsibility. It required redefining it. Responsibility was not only financial provision or strategic oversight. It was also emotional presence, reliability measured in attention rather than income. When the plane began its descent, Daniel felt a quiet steadiness rather than urgency. There were still contracts to review, employees who depended on his leadership, decisions that carried weight. But for the first time, he did not see those obligations as the center of his identity. They were components of it, not its foundation. As the wheels touched down on the runway, he understood that the lecture had not diminished his ambition. It had refined it. The ambition now was not to expand territory or increase valuation alone. It was to align his external achievements with internal integrity. And that alignment would not be proven in a single week or a single conversation. It would be proven in the ordinary days ahead, in how he chose to spend the hours that could never be reclaimed once they passed. When Daniel pulled into the driveway of his house in suburban Cleveland that evening, the structure looked exactly as it always had, a 2-story brick home with white trim and a 3-car garage. But he experienced it differently, as if he were seeing not the property value or the square footage, but the quiet history contained within its walls. He carried his overnight bag inside without turning on the television, something he usually did for background noise, and set his briefcase down near the staircase. The house felt orderly, almost staged, every surface clean, every object in place. For years he had taken pride in that order, believing it reflected discipline and success. Now he wondered if it also reflected absence. He walked into the kitchen and ran his hand along the smooth granite countertop, remembering family dinners that once filled the space with overlapping conversations and the clatter of plates. In recent years, meals had become solitary and efficient, eaten while reviewing reports or responding to messages. He opened the refrigerator, not because he was hungry, but because it was a habit to check supplies, to ensure nothing was lacking. Everything was stocked. Nothing felt shared. He closed the door gently and moved toward his home office, the room that had once functioned as the command center of his professional life. Framed awards lined the walls, certificates of recognition, photographs taken at ribbon cuttings and conferences. He studied one picture in particular, taken a decade earlier when his company expanded into a new region. He was standing at a podium, smiling confidently, while his former wife and son stood off to the side, slightly out of focus. At the time he had not noticed the composition. Now it seemed symbolic. He sat at the desk and powered on his computer, watching the screen illuminate the room with a cool glow. Emails had accumulated throughout the day, each marked urgent, important, high priority. He read them carefully, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he opened his calendar and began reviewing the next month. Meetings filled nearly every weekday evening. Automatically recurring commitments he had once accepted without question. One by one, he began to remove or reschedule those that were not essential. It felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible, yet he understood that busyness had become a shield. He then opened his contacts and sent his son a brief message proposing a visit to Denver the following month, not to discuss career plans, but simply to spend a weekend together. He kept the message straightforward and unpressured. After sending it, he leaned back in his chair and looked around the office again. The achievements on the walls had not lost their significance, but they no longer defined the entirety of his ambition. He realized that if he continued to operate exactly as before, the insight he had gained would fade into memory, reduced to an interesting experience in Boston. Change required structure just as business did. It required deliberate scheduling, measurable consistency, and visible follow-through. As evenings settled outside and the house grew darker, Daniel stood and turned off the office light. He walked through the quiet hallway with a different awareness, understanding that the real measure of the years ahead would not be captured in annual reports, but in conversations sustained, visits completed, and moments chosen intentionally rather than postponed. For the first time in a long while, the house did not feel like a monument to what he had built. It felt like a space waiting to be inhabited differently. 2 weeks later, Daniel stood in his kitchen on a quiet Saturday morning holding a boarding pass to Denver, noticing that the simple rectangle of paper carried more weight than any contract he had signed in recent years. The visit had been confirmed with a brief but warm reply from his son, who suggested they hike a trail near the foothills and have dinner at a local restaurant he liked. Daniel had agreed without proposing alternatives or upgrading the plan. He had learned that control was not always connection. Before leaving for the airport, he walked once more through the rooms of his house, not evaluating them as assets, but acknowledging the years they represented. He paused in the hallway where height markings still faintly showed on a door frame, pencil lines from birthdays long past. He had been present for some of those measurements and absent for others. The difference mattered now. On the flight west, he did not open spreadsheets or review quarterly forecasts. He read a small paperback copy of selected philosophical passages he had purchased after the lecture, underlining sentences not for presentation in a boardroom, but for personal reflection. One line stood out clearly: "A life out of balance does not collapse all at once, it drifts." Daniel understood drifting. It was quiet and gradual, disguised as productivity. When the plane descended toward Denver, the Rocky Mountains rose into view, steady and immovable. He felt a sense of humility rather than accomplishment. At the arrivals area, he spotted his son waiting near the curb, hands in his jacket pockets, posture relaxed but attentive. Their greeting was simple, a firm embrace that lingered a moment longer than usual. There were no dramatic speeches, no rehearsed apologies, just presence. During the drive toward the foothills, they spoke about ordinary things first: the changing weather, the growth of the city, a recent community project his son had joined. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions that were not strategic but curious. Later, as they walked along a trail that climbed gradually over 2 miles, Daniel felt the steady incline in his legs and welcomed it. Effort applied to something shared felt different from effort applied to expansion. They stopped at a scenic overlook where the city spread out below them, sunlight reflecting off distant buildings. Daniel realized that perspective had always been available, but he had rarely paused long enough to take it in. That evening, over dinner in a modest neighborhood restaurant, he told his son that he was still ambitious, still committed to leading his company responsibly, but that he no longer wanted achievement to come at the cost of alignment. His son nodded thoughtfully and said that consistency would matter more than promises. Daniel agreed. He understood that wisdom learned later in life was not a guarantee of redemption, but an opportunity for recalibration. As he returned to his hotel that night in Denver, he did not feel like a man who had solved everything. He felt like a man who had finally recognized what truly required his attention. The work ahead would not be measured in revenue reports or public recognition. It would be measured in time given freely, in conversations not postponed, in priorities adjusted while there was still room to adjust them. And for the first time in decades, that measure felt sufficient.